As we close in on the end of today's breakfast, I want to say a big thank you to the Wells Fargo organization, as they have in the past and have done again this year. Beyond their sponsorship, they have made it possible for us to bring back Peter Morici. With that, I'd like to ask Chad Lyon, Managing Director, Marine and RV, Wells Fargo DF, to the podium to make the introduction. Chad?
Good morning. So probably the easiest job anyone has on stage today is introducing Peter for his economic update. And I told Peter I'd be brief to maximize his time on stage, so here we go. First, Wells Fargo is very honored to continue to be the annual sponsor for the economic presentations as part of the Power Breakfast. There's probably no more important year for the economic updates than this year, given the questions and uncertainty in the global economy. And backed by popular demand, there's probably no better person to give us those insights than Peter. Peter is a professor emeritus of business at the University of Maryland. He's published weekly on MarketWatch, as well as the Washington Times and other publications and journals. His economic insights are sought regularly by BBC, Fox News, and other national news broadcasts. But more importantly, this will be Peter's third time on this stage addressing this crowd. He's a friend of the RVBusiness. Please welcome Dr. Peter Morici.
Well, it's nice to be with you. Most of all, this thing working? It's nice to be back in Indiana. Right now, it's the vogue in Washington. You get this in every speech they make. For example, the National Security Advisor, Jack Sullivan, made a speech on foreign policy. So he talked about Republicans like to cut taxes, that's bad, and in a foreign policy speech, and that the market doesn't work. And when I hear that, and I get it a lot, especially off mic, because after all, the press does have a certain orientation. I said, have you been to Indiana? I mean, Indiana does all the things that you say don't work, and Indiana is growing, it's expanding, it's thriving, without all the drama that Florida has. Maybe, Lieutenant Governor, you need to create a little drama so people will pay attention to all the great things that are going on in Indiana. I congratulate you, and I'm delighted to be here. Now, let's see if I can make this work. Can we advance? There, okay. There we are. Now, we are in a period of slow growth. Since the second George Bush became president, through ups and downs, the economy has grown at about 2% a year. The Trump period up to the pandemic was a little better, but let's face it, it was only 3 years. They had a very large tax cut. They couldn't do that again. We really don't know what would have happened if he had been around a little longer, and if those policies had been with us longer before the pandemic. You know, they would talk about 3% growth. Really, these days, the question is whether it's going to be 2% over the cycle. The economy can only grow. I know economics is numbers and details and all that stuff. And I did it because my father was a football player and I wasn't big enough, so I had to do something. Is that the economy can't grow any faster than the sum of productivity and labor force growth. It's an iron law of the universe. Just like matter is neither created nor destroyed, you can't grow faster than the number of workers you have that you can potentially put to work and your productivity growth. If we compare before and after the pandemic, productivity growth has been so-so at 1.6% a year, and the labor force growth has been virtually zero. We have more people working simply because we put those available back to work, but as you know, we have hit the wall. The only real solutions to all of this is to boost productivity growth and to do things that would get us more workers. In terms of more workers, we underestimate how many frustrated young people we have because they're not adequately trained. I mean, let's face it. One of the most overrated and least productive sectors of our economy are post-high school education. I mean, we literally admit half of the students that we admit don't graduate, or if they do, they earn a wage that's lower or the same as they would earn as a high school graduate. All that for the privilege of spending $100,000 of somebody's money, some of which they borrow and have to pay back. We have to, if we're going to have a more productive economy, simply do a better job of focusing higher education, or shall I say post-secondary education, to skills. In some ways, artificial intelligence offers an opportunity because so many of the jobs that we have that are skilled are, kind of boring. And artificial intelligence offers us the opportunity to replace those boring jobs and offer people opportunities. Don't take, you don't have to go to 4 years of college to be a programmer. And the colleges would like you to believe you do, but you don't. We can create a lot of decent training opportunities that take about 6 months. And so those are some areas we need to look at. We face the following long cycle challenges. China, for all of its problems and authoritarianism, is really making some notable technological strides. Consider the electric vehicle. The Chinese are out ahead of General Motors. It's that simple. Tesla's a wonderful enterprise, but it's small. It's led by a somewhat eccentric individual who is not wholly focused. He doesn't modernize his models very often. He's having to cut prices very rapidly. We're behind in electric vehicles. We're behind in battery technology. We're maybe even on artificial intelligence. For all of our emphasis on chips, once the Chinese have the chips, they can do most things that we do pretty well. Militarily, they have those hypersonic missiles that can push a button in China and knock out an aircraft carrier 2,000 miles away. The Russians have them. We don't. We spend $700, $800 billion a year on defense. The Chinese and the Russians together less than half of that, but they have the capacity to knock out satellites. We don't. They have hypersonic missiles. We don't. In a lot of ways, there's a lot of things in our economy that look that way right now. And we need to do a better job of spending money more effectively so that we can compete. We simply do. It's not just Chinese subsidies. We have a lot of inefficient pockets in our economy that are not being addressed. Climate change, I don't think anybody fully reckons whether you're in favor of electric vehicles, getting rid of gas stoves, teaching people to eat grass instead of meat, cut out the middleman or the middle animal, or you want to basically harden the economy, build a seawall around Florida, cut California off the Nevada border and push it out to sea. Whichever school of, it's very expensive. It's extraordinarily expensive, and no one has really explained how we're going to pay for that. Energy rebalancing, replacing oil with lithium and cobalt requires us to go from one lousy place to another. So instead of dealing with the Saudi Arabians, we'll have to deal with the Congolese or the Argentines in the triangle in South America. Essentially, the things that we need most are in some of the most undesirable places on the planet for decent people to do business. And we're going to have to reckon with the fact that we just have to do business with undesirable and indecent people if we're going to be able to get from point A to point B, something with four wheels and a steering wheel. It's going to be hard to accept, but we're going to have to do it. Our declining birth rate has to be addressed. This is a very delicate subject. Whenever I address it, people get angry with me. But our birth rate, well, the Chinese have a low birth rate, so do we. It's not quite as bad, but it's getting bad. Our birth rate is well below 2.1 per woman, which basically means without immigration, we cannot reproduce our population, our labor force, and so forth. So we have a very aging population in time, which will require a lot of care and not people to make stuff. You can ask people to work longer, but it's kind of hard to ask them to work past 70 or 75. You simply start to run out of days that you're not seeing doctors. I basically, people say, how often do you speak? And I say, I used to do it about once a month. Now I do it once every other month. So what happens the other months? Instead of seeing doctors. In any case, we need to do something about that. Immigration sounds like an easy solution. It's not. It takes about 2 generations to absorb an immigrant family into American culture. If you just think of the lady you know at the dry cleaner that takes in dry cleaning, who sent her kid to the University of Minnesota, Indiana University, the University of Maryland, and they become an engineer. If you look at most families, they're like the guy who cleans my house. The guy who cleans my house, he came as a boy from Central America. He runs a small crew. He has a small business. His son went in the Air Force. His son will go to the University of Maryland. If I look back on my Italian family, basically from the time my grandfather got off the boat to the first college graduate with a Morici last name, with a surname, was about 60 years. Some other families in the group, it was 40. It takes about 2 generations to turn a family into, quote, fully American, up to speed, advanced industrialized country type of. Most of the children are getting university training, doing very productive and skilled things. In the meantime, society bears a heavy cost in providing those opportunities because they're not self-financing. Middle-class children are just a very efficient way for a society to reproduce itself. Immigrants are a less efficient way, which means immigration policy should be focused on the best vets we can get, the most skilled people we can get, people to fill the gaps, and it shouldn't be randomized as it is today on the border. I was asked to say something. I'm trying to focus today on long-run challenges. I was asked to say something about the banks. I'm going to give you the banks real quick so I can stay on story. Essentially, coming out of the global financial crisis, where a lot of bad loans were made, loans that should have never been made, we have really ratcheted up lending standards and, to some extent, capital requirements. The reality is that the banks have not been lending out all their deposits or anywhere near their deposits. Instead, what they've been doing is investing in treasury securities, of which we print many, and investing in mortgage-backed securities because they have an implicit government guarantee, of which we print many. So it wasn't just the Silicon Valley Savings and Loan or Republic Bank with its zero-interest mortgages. About 30 or 40% of the banks out there, which are mostly regional banks, are loaded up with bonds. Sooner or later, the federal government, the Federal Reserve, has to raise interest rates to deal with inflation. It's a cyclical thing. Even if they go back down, they'll go back up again. When that happens, as you know from your finance departments, the sale value of those bonds, even if the par value to maturity doesn't change, goes down. And if you need the money to meet depositors' demands, you've got a problem. If depositors get it in their head that you don't have adequate marketable assets, and they get on the internet and they talk to each other, they run to the bank. We're hearing a lot in Washington, as we always, there's certain things that if you just pull the string, the bell goes off. One of them is, what do we know about the banks? Higher capital requirements. Last January, Silicon Valley Bank had about $210 billion, it was approximate, in assets and liabilities. In one day, they lost over $40 billion in deposits. There are no capital requirements large enough to protect the bank against that. Simply because if you held half of your deposit, if you had 50% of your deposits backed up by capital, remember, it's doing nothing. If you can't put it in bonds, it's doing nothing. You can't possibly provide banking services and loans at reasonable rates if you're going to have that much idle funds. More than that, when Citibank got in trouble in 2008, it had more than adequate capital. Silicon Valley Bank's problem wasn't capital. It was simply it held too many bonds. It was at the outer edge of holding too many bonds. What really happened and went wrong at Silicon Valley Bank was two things. The San Francisco Fed bank examiners saw the balance sheet and did nothing. It was said to me last night at dinner, well, it's terribly complex. No, if an economist that teaches school can understand reading the balance sheet, surely a bank examiner should be able to read the balance sheet. On page 92 of its SEC filing is the balance sheet. And you could see the number of bonds being held par that were below water, that were below, below market. The market value was below par. It was very, very obvious. Last January, nothing was done about it. The second thing is, it is the nature of banking to have this problem in the interest rate cycle, whether you're dealing with loans or bonds. There has to be a facility where you can go and basically borrow at par so that you can have money when you need it. That's why the Federal Reserve was established. It was a place where banks could go and borrow money against the loans they had made. But in those days, loans were mostly short-term. The Federal Reserve has now established for a period of 1 year such a facility. That has to be made permanent. That's really the only way out. The other is that there was some capacity for the Silicon Valley Bank to borrow the money. They could have gone to the Federal Home Loan Bank in San Francisco. They went late in the day of the $40 billion run. In order for the Federal Home Loan Bank to lend a bank money, it has to go sell some bonds. It doesn't have cash on hand. They came too late in the day to float the bonds, because you could sell bonds real fast. They came too late in the day to sell the bonds to bail out Silicon Valley Bank. That's simple. It was the absence of a place to borrow money against good U.S. Treasury securities. The Fed issued its report. It did what Democratic Feds always do when they're in and the Republicans are out, or Republican Feds do when they're in and the Democrats are out. What did they do? They blamed their predecessors. The person most responsible is the CEO of the Federal Reserve. The one person that didn't take adequate responsibility on that day was Jay Powell. He runs a very bureaucratic structure. He's the ultimate Washington swamp rat. He is. That's how he got the job. He's the ultimate political operative. And basically, it was too bureaucratic. The information was percolating up for 3 months from the San Francisco Fed that there was a problem, and nothing was done about it. It was Fed inaction that caused the Silicon Valley Bank. The Silicon Valley Bank provided an important and vital function. It understands the startup community better than any other institution. It made loans. More, it got repaid. Though it weren't the extend and pretend loans on its books. So much so that the next day, Apollo Capital wanted to buy the loan book. The people at Apollo Capital are not stupid. They don't buy loan books if the book is full of loans about to fail. Unfortunately, out of all this comes a problem. That vital institution, which actually understood the startup community, closed. Now, I'd like to leave banks for a minute and go back to the long-term challenges. I have to say that Joe Biden is the most successful president we have had since Ronald Reagan, in the sense that he has been able to put in place more of his policy initiatives than the two Bushes Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. If you reflect on their administrations, they all got one good bite of the apple, and they all generally got one thing they really wanted. Perhaps not even Clinton got one, because he didn't get his health care, but he got some other accomplishments. When you look at the string of things this guy's done, the Infrastructure Act, the American Rescue Plan, the CHIPS and Science Act, these things are very notable achievements from the point of view of legislative victories. And it's a testimony to Democratic discipline on the Hill. Because they had majorities, but they were narrow majorities, and they got them through. Most presidents just don't get this kind of success. So basically, he's dramatically increased the federal deficit because he's going to create a semiconductor supply chain in the United States, a battery supply chain in the United States, and so forth, in response to the things the Chinese are doing. The problem with this is the budget deficit is now much larger. The national debt is on track to be about 200% of GDP by the mid-2030s. Once it gets over 100%, what that means is if the nominal rate of interest on long-term Treasury securities is as high as the nominal rate of growth, you have to borrow money to just pay the interest. We're getting to the point where the federal government will have to borrow money to pay interest and then maybe to increase the debt as well. So the confrontation that's going on in Washington is about a real issue. Because in the president's budget, for example, there's no provision to deal with Social Security running out of money in 2032. When asked about that very directly, they respond with, the biggest threat to Social Security is Republicans that want to cancel it. Does anybody here know a Republican that wants to get rid of Social Security? Raise your hand. It's like saying the Democrats don't care about national defense. That's nonsense. They do. What's going on right now is a very important and difficult confrontation. The debt has to be addressed. We've run out of room. Now, if we don't address the debt that way, what will happen is we will be printing bonds to pay the interest on the bonds. It'll get bigger and bigger and bigger. Bonds are liquidity. They're not money, but they're close to liquidity. Because after all, since the dollar is the international unit of account, all international corporations hold dollars. But they don't hold dollars. They hold treasury securities that they can sell. So think of it this way. If a dollar is, is money, right? Global money, then a U.S. Treasury security is worth 75 cents on a dollar as global money. And so what we have learned over the last 3 years is if you print too much money, what do you get? Inflation. That's an outdated idea in this West Wing. It was also an outdated idea in the last West Wing. The principal difference is one group wants to spend money, wants to print money to spend more money. The other one wants to print more money to cut taxes. I mean, you had to sit at the White. I went to the White House. I sat down in the West Wing with Kudlow and his gang, and they had a chief economist there that was saying that if you cut taxes, it will pay for itself with growth. If you believe that, I have a physicist with a perpetual motion machine. Okay, so the consequences of all this is that for the foreseeable future, we have growth possibility of less than 2%. Inflation will be well above 3% going forward. The chairman of the Federal Reserve last week said that inflation expectations are well grounded. They're anchored. Okay. The New York Federal Reserve surveys consumers once a month. They are putting the average consumer's inflation expectation next year at 4.5%. The Conference Board surveys consumers every month. They're putting it at 6.7. They're anchored, but they're anchored in the wrong place. We're seeing now businesses building into their expectations that prices will go up each year rather than the need to keep their costs down because they won't be able to raise their prices. When I was a young man, which is like 1978. I did a brief stint in the government. It didn't go very well, I have to say. I guess I'm just not cut out to be a bureaucrat in the Department of Energy. But this is a very typical. What would happen is, I sat down with them and they said, "What do you want?" I says, "I want $26,000 a year, because that's what I would earn if I got a promotion in the government, which I will get eventually." They said, "Okay, we can pay you $26,000 a year." I said, "What else do you want?" I says, you have a 3-year waiting period on the pension. That gets waived. Because I'm going to move around a lot. 3-year waiting periods mean I'm going to be broke when I'm old. So I already lost 3 years at Augsburg College in Minneapolis. I'm not losing 3 years. Okay, we can do that. What else do you want? I says, "When do I get my first raise? Is it at least 10%? "Why are you asking that? You haven't done anything for me." I said, "Well, it's simple. At the rate of inflation we have outside right now, I know that I'm going to be 10% poorer in a year." They hired me despite that. Arrogant little. Anyway, through these people, I got to meet all kinds of important people. One of them was Paul Volcker. I was up at the Treasury with him, and he explained the same thing to me. I was talking to my daughter. She's buying a house. She's going to pay 11% mortgage. She says, "Why are you doing that?" "Oh, inflation's going to be 12% next year, 14% after that." I says, "Well, Mr. Volcker, what are you going to do?" He says, "Peter, the axe is coming down." He said, "This is going to happen." I says, "No, you're really..." He says, "Yes, I am." And 2 weeks later, the interest rates start going up. I know that this process with the interest rates is very painful, but there's 2 ways to deal with this. One is to take the medicine and get rid of inflation, and the other is to sort of, raise interest rates a little bit for a while, then ease off the pedal to wait and see what happens next, and so on like that. That's exactly what they did in the 70s, and inflation ratcheted from 2 to 4 to 6, and then it'll go back down to 4, then 8, then it'll go back down to 6. It was up and down, but the trend line was always the same. When poor Mr. Volcker took over, it was like 10, 12%. To put these interest rate increase in perspective, at its peak, we had inflation of about 10%. He has now raised interest rates to 5%. That's half of that. Volcker was facing interest rates of inflation rates of 10 or 12. He ended up with raising the federal funds rate to 18%. That's what has to be done. That's what has to be done. In this morning's Wall Street Journal, Greg Ip has a column. Everybody reads Greg Ip in Washington. He's the second brightest economist on the planet, I will acknowledge. You don't get ahead in Washington by putting a pot over your candle. It's simply the name of the game. The first thing you say in the morning when you get up to your wife or your husband is, "Aren't I the smartest that you..." And the inflation expectations are baking in. And the Wall Street Journal's money page says, and economy page says, is that if there's ever a place where you will find the conventional wisdom, it's there. That's the basic problem. People have now come to expect inflation. So the real solutions are going to be doing something about higher education, doing something about entitlements, doing something about the federal deficit, and taking the medicine on it. This administration won't do this. They'll lean on Powell not to do it. They have been successful on, we know on history that Powell can be leaned on. Because last year they leaned on him with his reappointment and he caved. Now, Biden is appointing people with marginal credentials, but adhere quite clearly. Appointing a labor economist to the Federal Reserve to make monetary policy is like going to an ear, nose, and throat guy to deal with a heart problem. Just because they have a PhD from an important university and they wrote about patent discrimination in the 19th century does not mean they know anything about monetary policy. But they all have as an article of faith that money doesn't matter, you can print as much as you want and there won't be any consequences to damn what goes on outside. I'd swear the windows are painted black at the Federal Reserve right now. They can't see outside. But we know that's going to happen. As a consequence, 2024 is really going to be slogged out, much like the Reagan-Carter election, depending on who the Republicans nominate. If they nominate Donald Trump, it's a gift to Joe Biden, because then he'd be able to campaign against Trump and all of the really unfortunate things he has done. It'll again be a character race, a decent person against an indecent person. Say what you want about Joe Biden and his son, the Republicans have never been able to turn that into an issue. It's only the fringe, people that watch Newsmax and, that can turn that into an issue. So, if the Republicans can get someone up there like a Nikki Haley, and if Nikki Haley can learn to articulate this way and develop some fire, then you can hammer him on, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Let me conclude with this. Who in this room today is better off than they were just before the pandemic? Raise your hand. There's one. Did you raise your hand? You went like this and pulled it down. Okay, is there anybody? That's what you have to campaign on. What that means for your industry is that I need to go up here, is that we're likely looking at sustained inflation. Okay, we're going to have a recession this year. This is the forecast. And we'll have a recovery next year. But for the foreseeable future, I see us looking at inflation of around 4%. My 2024 inflation number is 3.8%. My unemployment number is 4.1. So you're looking at basically an inflationary environment, growth around 2% a year after you have a recovery year next year. And interest rates at about the level you're at now. Because they'll go back up. They'll go down and they'll go back up again. Because they'll have to. Now, the good news about interest rates is it only hurts when you're going up. Once you've been up and you're there, it's much more manageable. Because after all, we have lived with much higher interest rates in the past. The stock market has gone up. People have bought and sold houses. They've traveled around in RVs. The world has not come to an end. But you'll be dealing with an inflationary environment. As the world is cyclical, look at the red numbers. This year is not a good year. Probably next year should be better for your industry. You should sell a few more RVs. But likely you'll have to wait for 2024 to be selling more RVs, getting the price points you want, and so forth. The biggest problems that I think you face is most of our large companies, the Winnebagos, the General Motors, the Procter & Gamble's, have been hardened and strengthened by the years of the global financial crisis. They can weather the storm pretty well. Dealers, in not just your industry, but in others, are in somewhat better shape. But still, the real pressure points in the industry for you are going to be the people that, independent operators of campgrounds, your dealers, and their bankers, to the extent they rely on smaller banks, because they're going to be more vulnerable to these changes, and it's going to take time as they fall off the map for new ones to come on the map, or as they change hands. It's going to be very difficult over the next year, for example, for campgrounds to invest. It's going to be very difficult for dealers to invest in more training programs, which you saw, and for technicians and so forth. So, that's where the pressure points are in the industry, and that's how I see the future for you. I know they call economics the dismal science, and I guess I've kind of lived up to that today. But I've always been pretty honest with you about the challenges you see, and that's how I see it. I'd be happy to take your questions. Please don't tell me I'm that intimidating. I know I'm from New York, I'm a Sicilian, but look, no rod. I don't carry a gun, honest. Can we get a question? Yeah. Oh, look, the Fed can print money. They have infinite liquidity. The thing about the Fed is all it has to do to create money is to buy bonds. When it buys bonds, it creates liquidity. And so the only problem the Fed has is if it buys bonds and then through its own interest rate increases, their value goes down and it has to. But at the rate it's selling bonds right now, given the size of its balance sheet, which is around $5 trillion, it's selling about $95 billion a month. It can sell. It's selling on the long end of the yield curve, and it's really not selling. It's just letting the mortgage-backed securities and treasuries it has on the longer end fall off. You know, it's redeeming them. So they don't have a liquidity problem. Other questions? And what happens if I sprout rings, become 26 years old again? I'll play shortstop for the New York Yankees. The question was, what happens if the yuan becomes the global standard? Remember, in order for the yuan to become the global standard, people have to feel comfortable holding Chinese government bonds in their corporations, international multinationals have to feel comfortable about the security of holding Chinese government bonds in their treasuries. Do you think that's about to happen? I don't think the dollar is particularly threatened because Japan is an old folks' home. Europe is always under threat of breaking up. The Eurozone is always under threat of breaking up. And China runs a terribly authoritarian regime. But let me give you a little perspective on this. The debt of the Chinese provincial governments, which the federal government has to back up, is 200% of GDP. Whatever our debt problems are, theirs are bigger because they do most of their borrowing through the provincial governments. And a lot of these things look like SIBs from the financial crisis. They're off the books and whatnot. The Chinese do not have a sound financial system, so it is not a good currency to be keeping your corporate assets in. And the other thing is, we all know that you can wake up on any morning and the Chinese government can take away what you have. At least here you can take the federal government to court. Another question? Oh, come on now. This is like teaching freshman economics at 8 o'clock in the morning, you know? I thought I gave that up. Well, listen, I'll be back. Oh, you have something? Okay, I'll be back here in a little while, and we'll have a little rump session, and you can sit close and, ask the questions you like, and I'll be happy to answer them as best I can. But let me just say, I always find it indeed a privilege and an honor and a great pleasure to be with you in Indiana. To me, this is God's country. God bless you.
Peter, thank you. If only we could all have the outlook and the depth of knowledge that you possess in your field. It certainly helps us understand the overall economic picture better. And again, let me remind you that in 10 or 15 minutes after we dismiss, Peter will be back up here to answer questions and or intermix with people. So we'll look forward to having Peter back. As a reminder, there's a couple things. We saw people taking pictures of slides and so forth, which is fine. This has been live recorded and will be available on the RVBusiness YouTube channel. If you want to look at any parts of it, it's there for your access. Secondly, on behalf of the organizing committee, all the sponsors, the presenters, B.J. Thompson and Associates, and RVBusiness Magazine, thank you so much for being here this morning. We wish you all the very best in the days ahead. Be safe and God bless.